to give a sort of a long sermon to the people of Israel before they enter into the promised land. Now, what's going on here? Well, a couple of things are going on here. One of the things is this. Before the people go across the Jordan into the promised land, right, they need to be reminded of some things. And so here's one of the really important things about Deuteronomy. For Deuteronomy, one of the spiritual exercises that the people of God need to do is they need to remember. One of the spiritual exercises that God's people need to do is they need to remember what God has done before and allow that to sort of be their point of orientation. Okay? If you forget what God's done, right, you're going to sort of march blindly into the future. We'll see an example of this in just a minute. Second thing is, as the people of Israel enter the promised land, Moses basically rehearses to them the whole law, the whole of Torah. And that's important too. That is, Moses here wants to make a really important point. Look, the land that you're about to enter isn't just a piece of real estate. It's not like, you've made your down payment, the deed to the promised land's been handed to you. Now you're kind of free to do whatever you want. No. The idea here is there's an essential connection between inhabiting in the land and living in a certain way. The land is the space in which the covenant is to be lived out. This is a really important point because one of the things we'll learn in the first chapter of Acts is this will be widened out. And now the whole creation will become the space in which the covenant is to be lived out. So really important point is being made here. So let's take a look here at the first part here of chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. I'm going to read to you Deuteronomy 1 through 8, and then just make some comments about it. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizhab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. After he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth in Edrei. Beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law. So Moses undertook to explain this law, this Torah, saying, "The Lord your God said to us at Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey, go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah and the hill country and the lowlands of the Negev and by the sea coast and the land of the Canaanites and Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that the Lord your God swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them and to their offspring after them." So a couple of important things are going on here that we just want to note. The first thing is this. We're being told here that once again the people of Israel are in what's called the Transjordan, that kind of area to the east of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross over into the land of Canaan. And then Moses undertakes as sort of almost like a refresher course to explain all the law to them. And the reason for this is there are several reasons for this, but one of the reasons is, as we learn later, they've been in the wilderness for 40 years to allow the Exodus generation to die off. And so a new generation has sprung up, and they need to be instructed. So really important point here in terms of religious instruction. Don't assume anything. Okay? Don't assume, instruct. Moses doesn't tell the people, oh, you probably all heard all this law stuff before. You've all bought the book. You've all taken the course. You all know this. Okay, let's move on. No. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is this. This is really important. God tells the people of Israel as they before they enter the land here that the land's being given to them in fulfillment of a promise that God made first to Abraham, was reaffirmed to Isaac, and then was reaffirmed again to the patriarch Jacob. And now, guess what? The promise is being kept. So here's the thing I said about why remembering the past is important, right? Israel is to think about the past not just as a series of sort of like random events. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Rather, they're supposed to think about the past as the history of God's faithfulness to them. Right? God made this promise to Abraham. It's now being kept. We're gonna see this is sort of like the beginning of a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of promises being kept. Now, then we have something else that has to be done, and this is Deuteronomy 1, 9 through 18. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just kind of give you read part of it and then say a few things about it. At that time I said to you, I am not able to bear you by... So now this is Moses talking. At that time I said to you, I am not able to bear you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times many as you are, and bless you, as he has promised you. How can I bear you myself, the weight and burden of you and your strife? It is, Moses says to the people of Israel, you guys are too much for me. Not just numerically, but you're all like a burden. You're all difficult. You never listen. I can't do this alone. I need help. So, choose for your tribes wise, understanding, and experienced men, and I will appoint them. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear small and great alike. So, two things about this. So, thing number one is, once again, a reminder. Moses says, you have multiplied. There's a whole lot more of you now than there were when we left Egypt. And then he uses this really interesting phrase, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. You may remember back in Genesis 15:5. Remember, God asked Abraham to come out of his tent and gaze up at the night sky and says, if you can count all the stars up there, you'll be able to count your descendants. So now that promise has been kept too. Okay, so Israel has sort of grown from a fairly small, insignificant people, essentially the family of Abraham, into something much, much, much greater. So once again, promise made, promise kept. That's important. But here's something else. God's been providentially guiding the people of Israel, but we learned something that's important to know about providence, right? Providence doesn't mean that you and I are then free to sort of like be irresponsible, right? Providence, God's working in our lives, doesn't mean we can just all say, hey, you know what? It doesn't really matter what we do because God will sort of take care of it all. We can make all the dumb decisions we want, and God will prevent the dumb decisions from harming anyone. No. That might be the thinking in some places. It shouldn't be the thinking in the church. So what happens here? Well, God's people need structure. Okay? The people of Israel are not supposed to be sort of like a mob or something like that, disorganized. Nobody knows what's going on. And so Moses here, in effect, delegates authority to elders, to commanders, and to judges. That is, we're going to see something that's really important here. God's providence doesn't mean that responsibility somehow just gets taken away from us. There's a certain element in which actually one of the effects of God's providence is it allows us to be responsible. It allows us to kind of become God's responsible covenant partners. That is, we generally have responsibility that's placed on our shoulders that we then need to discharge. And this needs to be done a certain way. So notice here, Moses doesn't say, okay, hey, you know what? We need leaders. Anybody's fine, it doesn't matter what their character's like. They can be relatively stupid and self-centered. It didn't matter. Just get some. No, he says something really important here. He says, choose for your tribes wise, understanding, and experienced men. Wise, understanding, and experienced. Okay, it's really important not only to have leaders, but to have folks who have a certain sense of wisdom, who have some kind of experience and who have understanding and therefore can make wise decisions. So once again, God's providence makes responsibility possible, right? It makes wise decision-making responsible. And then this, you shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. This is actually a reference back to Exodus 20. So once again, right? Okay, you need wise, discerning, and experienced leaders. In the case of those who have responsibility for making legal judgments, right? They need to be people who operate in a way that's sort of like completely fair, right? They need to be the kind of people who won't yield to pressure from the powerful and who won't overlook the weak. That needs to be a sort of standard. So that gets reaffirmed here from the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. Now then, what Moses does next is he tells a story that we've actually already read, but we're going to take a look at it again because it's a really, really important story. This is an incident that occurred back in Numbers 13. Moses reminds this generation of that story because it's really, really important. Okay? Once again, understand. Wise people remember and draw lessons from the past. That's one of the points here. And the story is this. I'll just read part of it to you and then I'll summarize the rest. The story here is the story of the people of Israel sort of sending out spies into the promised land to kind of scout it out and what that resulted in and what it didn't result in. Then we went out from Horeb. Horeb here is the alternative name for Mount Sinai. It's the same place. Then we set out from Horeb and went through a great and terrifying wilderness. And you saw on the way, on the hill country, the Amorites, as the Lord our God commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord your God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and take possession, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed. So they're in the Transjordan, and Moses says, okay, cross over in the promised land. We're going to send some scouts out there to kind of spy the place out before we cross over. And he underlines this fact, right? Okay, the Lord has given you the land. Don't be afraid. Don't let anything you see dismay you. Okay? Because the Lord's with us. He's given this land. He's promised it. You know, it's ours. We are going to inhabit it. So go and take a look at it. Well, of course, that's not what happens at all, right? What happens is that some of the spies go into the promised land. And they're immediately sort of overcome by fear. And so they come back with this kind of fantastical report about what the land looks like. And it's something like this. It's an awful place. Everyone there is 12 feet tall, and all their cities are surrounded by huge walls. We'll never take over this land. It's awful. Run for your lives. Not an inspiring word, okay? And this leads to a rebellion on the part of the people of Israel. And here's how Moses summarizes what happens in Deuteronomy 1:26. Yet you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, and you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us. Why are you going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. And that just sort of brings an end to the whole thing. So not only is everyone there 12 feet tall, but the walls surrounding all their cities go up to the sky, and we'll never climb over them. It's a hopeless cause, da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, here's the important lesson to be drawn from this story, and this is why Moses is repeating it. I think that one could sort of say here, based on Deuteronomy 1, we'll see this later on in the New Testament, that you can maybe think about, there are a number of ways you can think about faith, and we've thought about some of them. But one of the ways you can certainly think about faith here, right, is faith is the opposite of fear, which is the mode that Israel sinks into. Faith is the opposite of fear. That is, failing to trust God, what the scouts do is they cross over into the land, and the only context that they have for making sense of what's going on is simply what's in front of them, interpreted through the lens of their own anxieties. And you can imagine what that might look like, right? This is the equivalent here is, the person that has become addicted to cable news, right? And, spends a lot of time in front of it, getting increasingly anxious and angry about, whatever happens to be, relayed to them about this, that, or the other. So here's the point, right? Faith is the opposite of fear. What Moses has tried to do, right, is by reminding them of God's promise, he's tried to give them a context to properly understand what's going to happen in the land. And apart from that promise, they're simply going to be governed by their own anxieties and their own fears. And that's exactly what happens. Right? They run scared, and things degenerate from there. And notice, actually, they're not just afraid, right? They actually accuse God of bringing them to this point for the sole purpose of essentially of being annihilated by the Amorites. We know why you've brought us to this place. You brought us to this place because sitting here, we're sitting ducks for the Amorite army, which is probably at this moment coming over that hill to slaughter us all. You consider like they've been totally taken over by fear. Because God hates you. Yes, exactly. Now, I think one of the things that's really important here, and there are many things that are important here, right? But note that their conclusion actually is the exact opposite of the truth. God has literally walked with them through the wilderness. He's promised them the land. They are going to settle into it. God is with them. God has a providential purpose for them. But here's the point, they can't see it. They are so blinded by fear and distrust that they cannot see the purposes of God. And therefore, they just are taken over by fear. And by the way, we could also make another kind of little contrast here, right? If faith and fear are opposites, then we could make another contrast, and that is we can contrast obedience and fear. A fearful people are very unlikely to be obedient. Right? This is one of the significances of, and here we'll have to stop. This is one of the significances of the stories in the Gospels about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? Can you imagine the story in the Garden of Gethsemane being written along the lines of what happens here? I'm going to have to do what? They're going to do what to me? Ah! And off Jesus runs. That is, notice here, right? It's really important that the story of the Garden of Gethsemane is literally looking back at all of Israel's instances of unfaithfulness driven by fear. Because remember what Jesus says? Okay, if this is your will, then I'm 100% in. Faith leads to obedience. Fear leads in the opposite direction. Okay, well, we'll pick it up from there. We'll finish Deuteronomy 1 and then go into Moses' account of two initial battles, which are also really important.